So today I'm going to talk about a very peculiar, obscure topic, and I'll start to share my slides now so you can see more about it. Okay, so you're seeing my screen, correct?
Yes.
Great. It's obscure because there's hardly anything left of this type of art. So much of it was destroyed, and it's really only been studied in about the last 10 to 15 years or so. And I think you'll find it a fascinating and intriguing topic here. Now, but first, before we get into this, we're going to start in the United States in the late 19th century. So you're a hardworking man, because only men go to a pub like this, and it's been a long day and you want to go there after work to have a beer. You step inside and it's very dark, very smoky, lots of pipes and cigars. You sit down, you get served, and as your eyes adjust to the darkness of the room, you notice at the far end of the tavern, there's a duck hanging on the wall. Now, at this time in the 19th century, that wasn't too unusual. After people hunted an animal, you know, they often hung it on the wall before they were ready to prepare that. But it keeps capturing your eye. You can't stop checking it out. And finally, you are compelled to walk across the room and feel those downy, soft breast feathers. And to your amazement, it's a flat, hard surface. So what has just happened here? You have seen a trompe-l'oeil painting, which is a French term meaning to fool the eye. And this is a painting in our museum. And when I say our museum, I mean the San Diego Museum of Art, where I'm a docent. And I hope the next time we're able to get into the museum, please stop in the United States galleries and see this work in person, because it is quite remarkable. This was painted in 1883 by William Harnett. And the criteria for a painting that can fool the eye is, first of all, it has to be a non-moving, inanimate object. It needs to be life-size, no cropping of the subject matter, meticulous technique without visible brushstrokes, and a uniform light source. So in the last slide, you saw that the very clever tavern owner installed it with a window on this side so that the shadows would all make sense. Now, I call this the Rodney Dangerfield of painting, and I know that dates me. If you don't know Rodney Dangerfield, he was a comedian in the 1970s, and he always used to grab his tie and say, "I don't get no respect." Well, in some ways, this kind of painting didn't get much respect. Now, it wasn't that it wasn't popular. There were lines outside the taverns where William Harnett had his paintings hung. And in fact, they had to have women's mornings, one morning a week, where women were allowed to go in the tavern to see these works. But the art critics of the day thought that they were just worthless. And it was for three main reasons. One, because there was no imagination used to paint it. The second one is that it seemed dishonest. Why would you try to fool people? It was kind of like loaded dice or a crooked card game. And the third reason was that still life, by which I mean painting inanimate objects, was considered the lowest kind of subject matter. At the top would be religious or historical paintings. Next would be portraits of important people. Next would be landscapes. And at the very bottom would be still life. So poor Mr. Harnett, who had funded his own trip to Germany to study this technique, died a young and broad man, because really no one would pay him for this amazing skill. And what we'll see is that in China at various times, there was also a divergence of opinion on how worthwhile it was to try to paint such illusionistic art that mimicked reality. So during the talk today, we'll think about a few things. First of all, why does illusionistic art grab our attention? And then what was its history in China? And finally, when we get to the man of the hour, the Qianlong Emperor, I have to say that Lily C coached me on my pronunciation right before the talk. I'm not sure I can maintain it. So I apologize to all Chinese speakers for my terrible pronunciation. But anyway, we'll see why this emperor found illusionistic art so important. But we're going to stay in the West for a little bit longer. And now we're in the Italian Renaissance. This was painted by Giuliano Bugiardini, whose main claim to fame is that he was a classmate of Michelangelo. This is another painting from SDMA. And here we see every trick in the book to create the illusion of 3 dimensions on a flat surface. So let's look at them one at a time, because I'm going to be referring to these throughout the talk. First of all, size constancy. We know the size of a human being, or in this case, an angel. So the Virgin Mary is much larger, so we know that she's closer to us than the angel. And if you look in the far distance, there's some teeny tiny people here that shows us that we're having an immense expanse of view in this painting. Secondly, foreshortening. In the Middle Ages, halos were solid and they were always complete circles. But now in the Renaissance, we see these light ellipses that follow the head position so that they're in the correct orientation of the head. Third is linear perspective. So we see that built structures show us spatial recession as they go back in space. Fourth, chiaroscuro, which is simply Italian for light and shadow. So we know, because all the shadows are on this side, we know that the light source is coming from over here. And finally, atmospheric perspective. So just as in reality, distant hills become pale, indistinct, kind of blue. So we get the feeling of distance from that. Now, as we'll see, some European artists went to China, worked for the emperors. They were quite interested in all but one of these characteristics, one of these strategies for depth. And you can guess which one it was. It was chiaroscuro. They hated chiaroscuro on people because to them, this didn't look like a shadow on the Virgin's face. It looked like half of her face was dirty. So that was right out for the most part until very late in the Qing Dynasty. And we will see how these European artists had to modify what they did for the tastes of their patrons. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that I'm saying that illusionism started in the West. Certainly, illusionistic art had a very, very early beginning in China. However, we have nothing extant to look at. But in written records, there's a description of illusionistic murals all the way back in the Western Han Dynasty, around 2,200 years ago. The oldest paintings that we can see are along the Silk Road in Dunhuang, where the desert conditions, the low humidity allowed these paintings to survive. So here's an example of some celestial musicians. And you can see how they are within niches. And there's a suggestion of recession here where this wall is closer than this wall, and this wall is closer than this wall. So they are within a space. We find that in a lot of religious art, the 3-dimensionality is important in many cultures. Why would that be? Well, religious art often tries to allow the viewer to feel like they can commune with an alternative space, a spiritual space, whether it's heaven or hell or some other type of space. So the 3-dimensionality of being able to almost walk into that scene is important for a lot of religious art. So this was being made around 500 or so CE. What was being made in the West at that time? Well, the examples we have to look at are mosaics. And in Byzantine mosaics, we don't see much interest in depiction of depth and spatial recession. There's a little bit perhaps of size constancy where we assume she's a lot closer than he is, but usually there's not much as far as environmental depictions of depth. Now, of course, there may have been other art besides mosaics that did not survive that were interested in depth, but at least as far as the mosaics, that was not a principal concern at that time. So let's go to China now and talk about that divergent attitude about realism in art. And for this, I'll have to do some basic, I feel a little embarrassed or timid about discussing Chinese history because I know many of you know it way better than I do, but I'm going to talk about a few basics. So we know that the Emperor Huizong was not only a great art aficionado in the Northern Song Dynasty, but he was also a tremendous artist himself. And this is one of his paintings here. He took a great interest in the artists in his academies and his court art. So he determined what was painted, how it was painted. He devised his own style of calligraphy. And it is recorded that in the Northern Song, he favored the depiction, creation of large illusionistic murals that supposedly made you feel that you could walk right into them. So that was important to him. And as we know, he unfortunately paid more attention to the arts than defending his borders. So in 1127, I believe, the Jurchen Jin swept down and conquered this capital. And they hauled him and 3,000 of his court and untold treasures up to the north, where everyone died in captivity eventually. And they pretty much burned down all the precious palace treasures that, you know, it would have been an amazing thing to have, but they're mostly gone. One of his sons was not in Kaifeng at the time of the attack, so he managed to escape down to the south, where he set up the Southern Song Dynasty, which survived for about 150 years. As you might expect, the art of the Southern Song deals a lot with loss and a grieving of what had been lost. And it developed these scholarly amateur literati started painting. Now, the highest art form for them was poetry, and then calligraphy, and painting was third. And you can see how painting was, the brush strokes here are really an extension of their calligraphic skills. They were not interested in making you feel like you were actually looking at a place. This is a poetic and philosophical extension of their work. And they really disdained realistic, colorful, realistic art, because that was done by artisans. They were intellectuals. And wall painting was even lower than scroll painting. So you would not have the literati be interested in attempting any kind of mural. Now, speaking of the literati, we want to mention hand scrolls. There's a certain experience of viewing hand scrolls. First of all, it's a precious object in a silk sleeve in a box. You go to take it out, you are preparing your mind to have this experience. You lay it in front of you, opening it from the left and rolling it up from the right. So you're looking at shoulder width portions of it, moving at your own pace through that scene. Now, here's a very famous hand scroll at the National Palace Museum, and I have it here fully unfurled. So you can see the height to width ratio. I don't know how long this one is. Some of them are over 30 feet long. And we can see the calligraphy at the front and the colophon at the back. And the subject, the title, is the 10,000 miles of the Yangtze River. So just imagine scrolling through this. It's like you are walking along this beautiful scene. And of course, this is not just a physical journey. We could think of Taoism, the way, a metaphorical journey as well. So here is a close-up of, I think, this section. So you can get an idea of just the masterful brushwork that's being done here. And the other part I wanted to say is that what is typical of Chinese art is what we call moving perspective. So as you are taking this journey along the riverbanks, every scene, there's no one spot that's privileged over any other spot. Every point you look at is the ideal spot to contemplate and to view. That's very different than the West, which is you need to stand right here. This is the spot you need to look from. So we'll see that distinction when we get to the murals that I'm going to talk about. So the hand scroll also incorporates the fourth dimension of time, because it is specifically guiding you to look at this through time. So here is the topic of the day, which is pronounced Tong Jinghua, and I don't know if I'll be able to maintain that. And that means to cross into or move through scenes that are painted. In the Qing Imperial records, they talk about about 100 of these, but only a mere handful remain, and some of them are not accessible to scholars, and few are in original locations. So here we have a rather sad, unrestored Tong Jinghua that will show you the basic elements, and it's in the Forbidden City in Beijing. In the front, we have a wooden framing device, almost like you'd see on a stage. It's carved and painted. Behind that, we have another wooden panel, but is it really a wooden panel? If you look more closely, you can see that there's a crack here that extends up the plaster into the wood. So this is a faux wooden panel. We are being taken from the world of reality and gradually into this illusionistic world. Now, originally there would have been doors on both sides. So this door would have been the interior of this building. You see how the poles and the crossbeams stop at the edge? This would have been a view to the interior. Here where you see this pile of rocks, this door would have been a cave entrance, and we'll talk about Taoist cave heavens later on. So you're having this beautiful vista that gives you the illusion of space, and then these two ways to penetrate into the scene. So you've been taken from your reality of being in this building to another place. And that was very important spiritually and psychologically for some of these emperors. But here, as opposed to the hand scroll experience, the optimal viewing site is right here. So this is not as effective, and this is not effective. So you'll see that these illusionistic murals have an optimal viewing position. So very basic review of the Qing dynasty. It was preceded by the Ming dynasty, a powerful dynasty, and the important contrast is Ming emperors were Han emperors. So the vast majority, well over 90% of Chinese identify with the Han ethnicity. And so when they were conquered by the Qin, when they were conquered by the Manchurians from the north to become the Qing dynasty, this was foreign rule. So as you can imagine, there was a very harsh beginning to this dynasty. And in fact, there were 40 years of revolts by Ming loyalists that had to be violently suppressed. And what we have is this phenomenon of a tiny minority that's ruling over this vast Han population. So the Qing both had the desire to preserve their own culture, the Manchurian culture, but they were entranced by elements of Han culture. And we'll see that dichotomy coming up. And this was the last, in 1912, this was the end of Imperial China. And then we had the Republic of China, and then on the mainland, the communist regime. So I just wanted to place that in history for you. The first four Qing emperors are here. These three, they're called the Great Qing. So their cumulative 136-year rule was considered the highest point, both as far as political power and culturally, of the Qing dynasty. The Kangxi Emperor has been considered by many one of the greatest emperors in the history of China. His greatly favored grandson, who was groomed to be emperor from a young age, was the Qianlong Emperor. And the Yongzhen Emperor was no slouch either, but these two shone so brightly that he is not as well known. So we're going to be talking primarily about Qianlong. I think it's Qianlong. Lily C, you've got me thinking about that now. So let's look at the Qianlong Emperor as he wanted to be depicted. 3 portraits he commissioned of himself. Here we see him as a young man with his father, the Yongzhen Emperor, and here they are Taoist scholars. We see them behind this prominent scholars rock. Their scholars' implements are on the table. This is about philosophizing, understanding the Tao, their place in history, and so on. Here we see him in a very different guise as the ruler on his throne. And here we see him in what looks like a traditional Tibetan Thangka painting as the divine Bodhisattva Manjusri. So he believed that he was an incarnation of the Bodhisattva of wisdom. Now I'll show you a Western depiction of this emperor. We cannot ask him, but I bet if we did, he would say that he hated this depiction. Because again, look at the shadows. You know, he looks kind of haggard, and he probably would have seen this as a sign that he was being depicted so dirty that he left a stain on the chair. This would not be, I mean, you can just compare it to his preferred presentation to the way a Western artist has depicted him. And frankly, a lot of the Western artists, I believe, in subtle and not so subtle ways, depicted foreign rulers as grotesque, because that served the imperialist design to subjugate other cultures as inferior. So, you know, he doesn't look particularly all powerful and calm here, and I don't know if that was by design or not. Now, these three paintings, surprisingly enough, were not painted by a Chinese artist. They were painted by the supremely talented Italian Giuseppe Castiglione, and we will get to him in a moment. So this shows you just how versatile this artist would be. Now, first, I want to talk a little bit more about Qianlong and how he was just so not only intellectually curious, but very playful. He was really big into archaeology. So they dug up and carefully cataloged many of these ancient bronzes. Here we see a Zhou Dynasty bronze wine vessel, or hu. Now, he had 40 different workshops, everything from jade to ivory to bamboo to silk textiles. He could have told his bronze workshop, make me an identical object like this and then patinate it so that it looks centuries old. But he may have done that. In fact, I don't know. But here's another thing he did. He asked his porcelain workshop to make a simulation of an ancient bronze hu. And if we take a closer look, you can see just the brilliance, I mean, the technical brilliance of this glaze that imitates bronze, and he even has them put in, chemically create what looks like the beginning of a verdigris patina, as well as just this meticulous carving into the clay that they did. And here's another playful thing he did. So we know that there's these Tao Tie faces on many of the ancient bronzes, and here's a easier to see example. We don't know exactly what they mean. There's several theories about what they were supposed to signify. Well, look at the Tao Tie face he's placed here. He's even placed these rods that were used for piece mold bronze casting for the originals. But no ancient Tao Tie ever had slanted eyes like this or S-shaped eyebrows. So again, he is not really trying to fool us. It's a kind of an intellectual conversation. It's like we're in the in crowd. If we know the historical reference, then we are in that in crowd of intellectuals that studies history. And of course, in China, looking to the past was always looking toward perfection. So this is a kind of mind that he had, and his devotion to study and expressing it in new forms of art. Now let's go to Giuseppe Castiglione, who was given the Chinese name of Lang Shining. He was born in Milan, trained in art both in Milan and Genoa, joined the Jesuits as a lay brother in 19, assigned to China in 1715. And the Chinese emperors, they'd had some amateur artists in the Jesuits, and they said, we need a professional artist. Just let him know that he will never leave China. So Castiglione signed up for that, and he worked for all three of the great Qing emperors. He was the leading artist for the Imperial Wish Fulfilling Studio, or Ruiguan, where Chinese, Manchu, and European artists worked side by side. They were exclusively responsible for the Tongjinghua murals And many artists would work together on these. And they were busy. They were just inundated with projects and paintings and decorative things. He was an architect. They did fountain design. I mean, I imagine it was a very pressured and stressful working environment. And I love what someone said about him who knew him. He was humble and gentle, but full of courage. He received great honors when he died. I can't remember the details, but the Qianlong Emperor honored him. So last time I gave this talk, I received a question that I realized I should have addressed. Why were the Jesuits there in the first place? What was in it for them? Their goal was to convert everyone on the planet to Christianity. And remember, this was the age of enlightenment, the 18th century. So it was about science, rationality, organizing, categorizing, understanding, and they were trying to mesh that into their religious practice. So they were not just bringing art there, they were bringing all kinds of scientific innovations to the Chinese emperors, engineering, chemistry, astronomy, navigation, hydraulics, I mean, you name it. They brought all this technology to the emperors. And their feeling was, when the Chinese emperors see our understanding of how the real physical world works, even in our art, they see the observation of how the real world looks. How could they come to any other conclusion than that the Christian God is the one true God? That was their expectation. Now, on the other side of the equation, the Qing emperors were, of course, happy to learn about all this technological and scientific innovations. And they were interested in what foreign people believed, but they certainly had no intention of becoming or promoting Christianity within their domains. So the Jesuits had this vision, and here we can see a Jesuit and supposedly an emperor who are united with this new art of, or improved level of cartography. And they are under the rays of Jesus as Christian brethren. So that never occurred. But at the point we're talking about, the Jesuits didn't know that yet. So they were still working very, very hard to impress the emperors. So this is where I thought I'd take my first pause for questions. And so many of you have a lot of knowledge. If you want to make comments about anything I've discussed, feel free to do that here.
Okay, when I don't see any hands raised yet. However, Sharon Beckus had a question from the chat box. I don't know if Sharon would like to state her question directly, or if she'd prefer that I say it out loud.
No, I don't. I can state it.
Awesome.
Thank you. I have a question about the hand scrolls. Hand scrolls are fascinating to me. The length of them, how long they are, and also the fact of, as they're painting each section, I don't know whether they're painting or what kind of medium they're using, but do they have to wait for each section to dry before they go to the next section? And then how long do they have to wait if that's the case?
Good question. Well, this is water-based pigment, so it dries pretty fast. Okay. And it may be on either a silk or paper base. And I imagine they would be working along from section to section and letting it dry. One of the reasons I am so interested in art is I was sent to Taiwan when I was 16 for a summer visit to learn Mandarin. I was a complete goof off and managed not to learn anything. But we got to visit the National Palace Museum on that visit, and it just blew my mind. And I still remember seeing an incredibly long display case with one of these hand scrolls and scrutinizing every section of it, because I thought surely they would get tired and get careless somewhere, and there would be some sloppiness in technique. And by God, every part looked perfect. And I don't know if they had multiple artists, working on it. I don't know enough about that process, but they're remarkable constructions.
So was the scroll open all the way at first, so they would just continue, or did they open it section by section?
I would think for the really, really long scrolls, and I'm just guessing, that they would allow it to thoroughly dry and close parts of it and not have a 30-foot long table to work on the whole thing. Although that also would present problems as an artist, right? If you want a uniform vision and you're only seeing a piece of it, then
Sure.
you have to remember what you've created and keep that intention in your mind. It certainly would be easier to be able to scan the whole thing and see where you were and where you're going. So I don't know if they built ultra long tables or if they actually only saw part of it as they were creating it.
Thank you.
Sure.
I can see that the next person who has their hand raised is Heather Zimmerman. If you'd like to unmute.
Yes, hi. I have a question also about the scrolls, and I wanted a clarification on reading them. Do you read them from right to left, which was my understanding, but I thought I heard you say you unscroll it from the left and then move to the right. And the follow on to that is this universal, and is this the way you would read any Chinese painting or wall mural? Do you start from the right, if that's the case, in every reading of the narrative of this kind of artwork? Could you clarify my understanding of this? Thank you.
Sure. Heather, so it's my understanding, and please correct me anyone if I'm wrong, that you are reading from right to left. So what that means is you open it on the left side, and let's see, let me think. You are unrolling it. Now I have to think about how this works. It's rolled up in one circle. It's not two circles when you start. And you would be opening it on the right side and then coiling, re-rolling it on that right side and unrolling it on the left. Not having handled a lot of hand scrolls, I'm having to visualize it, but you are correct. It is right to left. So you're closing it, re-rolling it on the right as you move left.
Right. So if I approach a painting, for example, also, I should focus my attention to the right side first and then move my eye towards the left. Would that?
I believe so. Now, if you're looking at a wall scroll meant to be seen all at one time, very often it's a vertical composition and there isn't a prominent right to left movement for your eyes. But so a hand scroll is different than that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Sure.
I can see that there is one more hand raised. Chia, would you like to unmute yourself?
Okay. Yes. Also about this scroll, I just wonder how long it is, because we know in our museum, San Diego Museum of Art, we have this long scroll of the Ming Empress, and that is 90 feet long. It's very long. So I wonder if you know how long is this 10,000 Yangtze River.
I could not find the overall length of it when I looked around. So I was hoping to have that, but I don't know. I mean, you can tell, the average height of an image would be probably at least this tall. So you could see from the height to width ratio that it is very, very long. But yeah, I don't know. And I know, Xiaowei, the one that you're talking about, because the museum could only, because these works are light sensitive, the museum can only show us a section at a time. And then after a few weeks, they have to roll it to show the next section so that no one area gets too much light exposure.
I believe the hand roll is not something to be displayed like a Western artwork. It is like a book. You open it. When you want to enjoy it, you open it. When after you finish it, you roll it up. So it's never subject to a lot of light exposure.
Right. That's why museums are showing these things not in a way they'd ever be used. So you're exactly right. A scholar would have a bookcase or something with all these boxes of precious hand scrolls. They would be in their silk sleeves. You would take it out to have that experience, and then you put that precious object away so it wouldn't get a lot of light exposure in normal use. Okay, shall we continue?
I do see one more question from
Okay.
Loretta and Tom. If you
All
would
right.
unmute. There we are. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Tom Hom,
Hi.
and I'm 93, and as I grow older, I become very appreciative of the Chinese art, especially the way you have presented it, Elaine. And my grandfather came from China in 1884. My father had 12 kids, 9 boys, and I'm number 3. And during this period, our house was decorated with Western and Chinese as we were growing up. And I've never had the opportunity to view the Chinese art, the background, the culture, as well as you have presented it to us today. And I just want to tell you how meaningful that is to us. I have a closet throughout the year. So many people, when we visit China, so forth, they'll present us with a scroll. And well, we got them rolled up, maybe about a couple dozen in the closet. And what you presented to us, to me today, I'm going to go see these scrolls. I'm going to open them up and really appreciate them, because there's just so much art in there, the way you described it, that it never occurred to me. I am somewhat of an artist, a Western artist. So I've been painting ever since I was a teenager, and I still paint. But you brought a new, let's say, dimension in art to me, presenting the history of Chinese art. So I just want to share that with you.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
By the way, 4 of my daughters gone to Taiwan on that summer trip too, as well.
Oh,
And
really? Yes, that
thank you.
was a rebellious summer. We American kids did not cooperate, I have to say. Well, thank you. And I hope you do enjoy, you have treasures in your home, and it's nice to take time to really look at them. Well, let's go back to what the Western artists did bring to China, because as we saw way back before, 500 CE, they were already thinking about depth and perspective. But what the Western artists brought was one point or convergent perspective. And here we see an early painting by Leonardo da Vinci. And I want you to note all the orthogonal lines. And we're so used to seeing this kind of depiction, we probably don't even give it a second thought, but all these lines are lining up to a certain point. Can you see them all? They're all going to a certain point. Where do you think that point is? If we line them up visually, they all go to what's called the vanishing point on the horizon. And the science of one point perspective was figured out by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi, who also figured out how to create that giant dome on the cathedral in Florence so that it would not collapse under its own weight. Let's look at an example of one point perspective done for the Chinese emperors. So this was painted after Castiglione's death, but he was a teacher. So all these techniques were learned from him in large part. First of all, how big is this work of art? And we can see here that it is quite large. So the purpose of these big murals is to fill your visual field. And as in that first rather sad Tong Jinghua that I showed you, there is a real frame of wood in front of it. And behind that, there's this faux wooden panel. So we see this kind of stage-like presentation here. And now we can look for the orthogonal lines. So you see how these lines are all converging at a single point. And if you try to visualize where that point is, it is actually right at this urn, this antique bronze, probably bronze urn. And that is right under a painting of the 3 venerables, luck, prosperity, and longevity. And here we have a poem written by the Qianlong Emperor. So let's also look at the people involved. What do you think about how the people are depicted here? To my eye, they look like cut out paper dolls. I mean, this woman here looks like she's painted on the receding sidewall of the room. There are no shadows on their faces or bodies. They cast no shadows. And if we're looking for size constancy, these children are very close to us. These children are way behind this back wall because they're outside playing. And yet they are the same size as these children in the foreground. So you can see that what the Chinese emperors were intrigued by is the whole notion of environmental space, how that is enclosing the figures. But they did not want their depiction of figures messed with in any way, especially women and children. These are not portraits. They're more symbols of a harmonious Confucian household where everyone understands their role and is performing accordingly. So there's this fascinating combination of Western and Eastern aesthetics in these paintings. And I have to show you this really fun Trompe painting that's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, painted by the great Charles Willson Peale. And he was a Renaissance man. Besides being an artist, he was a scientist and naturalist. He started museums. He was an archaeologist. He was an art critic. He was pretty influential in politics. He was everything. And he named all his children after famous Renaissance artists, which gave some of them a pretty big complex, actually. This is his painting of his sons, Raphael and Titian Peale. And you'll notice this kind of gimmicky thing he does here, which is so clever. He places the first step as a real step that protrudes into our space. And then there's a real door jamb around this. So how does he make this so effectively look like it's a space going behind this wall? He relies a lot on chiaroscuro, light and shadow. So for example, in Titian's face, we see the shadow of the door jamb on there, and then the rest of his face is in light. We see his knee pop forward and be lit up. We see that Raphael has cast a pretty strong shadow here. Even the paint, these little blobs of oil paint, can you see how there's the tiniest little rim of shadow on the side of them that really gives them dimensionality? So as the museum's website says, even George Washington is believed to have tipped his hat to greet the young men when he first saw this work of art, which I think is such a charming anecdote. And that's part of the fun of trompe-l'oeil. It's that initial misperception when you catch it and your mind takes a double take, and there's something that feels funny about it. You're kind of shocked, but it feels kind of funny, kind of delightful. And even if you see it again, you still may be, if you walk by in the corner of your eye, you may still be fooled again after the first time, but eventually you won't be fooled. But there's still the memory of that initial episode. And that's what makes these works so memorable. I think it's the sudden reorientation of the mind that makes them quite delightful. So we're seeing a doorway as a trompe-l'oeil painting. Let's compare that with a Chinese example. Now, this is a photograph I took from a book photo, so the colors are all washed out. But we see here two doorways, and that's an excellent foil for trompe-l'oeil art because you can go through that, right? You can go in and out of that. So it helps to break that picture plane down. We're not seeing the reliance on chiaroscuro here, of course, maybe a little bit here, but no shadows on the figure or her gown. Instead, what is this artist having to rely on to get us to see depth? The main thing this artist is using is linear perspective. So can you see how these lines are all at different angles? And in fact, the vanishing point is outside the painting. So we have to mentally connect the dots, so to speak, to create that vanishing point. It's a little more mental effort on our part. Now, this was created for the Yuanmingyuan Emperor, Qianlong's father, when he was a rather rowdy teenager. And I guess they wanted him to settle down. And this was a full life-size, one of 12 panels of beautiful women. So part of the message is, you need to comport yourself appropriately. And if you are emperor, this is what will be at your disposal. So it's probably pretty effective for this teenager. There is so much to talk about in this image. First of all, as I mentioned, the Manchurian emperors had their own culture, but at the same time, they were enamored and fascinated and lusted after this sensual southern Chinese culture from the Jiangnan region. And we see elements of that here. First of all, a good Confucian wife would not be dawdling at a doorway, letting men see her, or even waiting for her husband. She would be inside taking care of her in-laws and the children and managing the servants and doing some needlework. So we know that this is not a wife, this is a courtesan. And what I found particularly funny was to read in James Cahill's book that this was the equivalent of soft pornography. It was considered shocking to look up a woman's silk sleeve, because at that time, the hand and especially the inner wrist was considered an erotic zone. Now, the courtesans were some of the best educated women in China at that time. And there's this romantic notion of the literatus scholar and the courtesan having this very erudite relationship. She would know poetry, calligraphy, painting. She could play a musical instrument. They could have a very intellectual conversation. So you'll notice there are two thresholds here. So this represents where that level of entertainment would occur. And then at the right moment, she would take her gentleman caller through the next threshold. And we see how this curtain kind of echoes her body shape. And here there's just a bit of two stools being shown that this is a room for two people. The other thing about the South is we see these planters of tropical looking plants. So the Qing emperors, they made it a point to get down to the South whenever they could. These were called inspection tours, but they never did inspection tours to Central Asia. That was just for conducting wars. But they got down to southern China quite a bit, and they would float down the rivers, and the local ladies would be brought to them in the evening. And the Suzhou area has always had the reputation for the most beautiful women in China, as well as incredible garden culture, these beautiful, mysterious gardens where you turn the corner and there's another vista, and very sophisticated silk textile industry. So we see elements of all this down here. And so for this young teenage prince, it's not just about you can have any woman you want, but you will be in control. This will be part of your empire, this beautiful, exotic, southern, semi-tropical part of China. That will be yours if you conduct yourself right and become the emperor. So let's go back to his son, the Qianlong Emperor. And he had public and private concerns. So what were his public concerns? He built a massive empire, so that required a lot of maintenance. There were a lot of foreigners coming to China, so he had to control their influence. And of course, his most important duty was ensuring the continuity of the dynasty with an heir. His private concerns, he was kind of a spiritual dabbler, so he got involved in different varieties of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism. He also appeared to be a very affectionate father. Here he is with some of his many sons. And he was really concerned about planning for a peaceful retirement. As many of us know, after a busy career, you're thinking about what's going to be happening down the road. And he certainly was thinking a lot about that. So let's look first at his public concerns. He was an incredible military commander, and all this area was added during this great Qing period. And I'm a little bit unsure how much of this the Qianlong Emperor added himself personally and how much was added by his father and grandfather. But he certainly added most of that through these 10 great military campaigns. So he basically, just about doubled the size of the country. And so there were many conquered peoples of very different cultures that he was now ruling over. This is two views of the same painting, which tells us how terrible color reproduction is on the internet. It's not really a mint green horse, but I wanted you to see the whole painting and a close-up. This is an image of the Kazakhs performing tribute, offering tribute gifts to the Qianlong Emperor. And so we see up close, you know, he's depicted a little larger because he's more important. We see the traditional kowtow. This was a way for both sides to save face, because in fact, the emperors gave back presents that were worth at least as much as the tributes that they received. So for the subjugated peoples, they could view it more as a trade exchange, whereas the emperor could view it as utter admission of defeat and that they were now part of this dependent part of the Chinese empire. And these were particularly valuable gifts because the Central Asian horses were legendary. They could not breed good horses down in China proper. So this was an important gift. So speaking of tribute animals, I want to show you this big Tongjinghua. Oh, no, I haven't. Before we get to that, let me just talk a bit more about Qianlong as a military commander. Here we see him in his fancy garb, but if you subtract the expensive silk brocade, notice how his uniform is exactly like any Manchu general. The same tasseled helmet with the side panels, shoulder pads, the wrist guards, long jacket, the boots. So here he is hanging on to his Manchurian heritage as rough, tough hunter horsemen from the north. They were very proud of that. But what's new here, oh, first I should tell you, this is a life-size painting. The man and horse are life-size. What's new here is the iconography of a ruler on horseback. And for that, Castiglione brought his European heritage. We can look at a painting from 100 years earlier by Diego Velázquez of the Spanish King Philip III. So we can see that this has become a symbol of the ruler controlling a noble steed as a symbol of controlling the empire. And that was taken to China. But look at the difference. Here we see a lot of chiaroscuro that anchors this horse to the ground. This horse casts no shadow. It looks like he's floating. So how does Castiglione create a sense of depth in this painting? You can't use linear perspective. There are no built structures here. There's some size constancy, these close-up of these plants that are bigger than these trees. But the main thing this artist uses for this painting is atmospheric perspective. So look at how sharp the colors are, so bold and sharp here. Whereas the background, this fades even just on the other side of the horse. So he's fading this out very profoundly until this very background is almost invisible. It almost merges with the color of the sky. And I think that's a good example of how talented artists looked at what's in their toolbox and used what they could based on the subject matter and the preferences of the patron. So now we talk about more tribute animals. This is a 17-foot wide painting. And in the Imperial, unlike European palaces, in the Forbidden City, you certainly have grand spaces for public things like entertaining generals or whatever. But the domestic quarters, even for the emperor, are usually fairly small rooms. So a 17-foot wide painting may have been the entire wall or most of a wall in the room. This was painted for Qianlong's eyes alone. This was for him to see and to sit in front and contemplate. So what would he get out of this? First of all, we see him back in his Taoist scholar's outfit. So he's not the military conqueror at this point. And he's looking at these peacocks that are trained. So the handler here is clapping, and these peacocks are bobbing and dancing and opening up their feathers. This is significant because this is most likely a tribute from the Dzungar people. That was another Central European people that were really fierce. They were really hard to conquer. In fact, Qianlong's father, the Yuanmingyuan Emperor, had failed. So of course, Qianlong had to restore his father's honor. And he just threw, I don't know if it was tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of troops and all the materiel to just crush the Dzungars. They were also along the Silk Route, so it was a very important territory to control. So as he looks, as he contemplates these animals, he's thinking about a very arduous and expensive conquest and his role, his responsibility as the leader of this dynasty. Also, peacocks had a lot of symbolism. The eyes in their feathers were a symbol of the eye, the compassionate eye of the Buddha in Tibetan Buddhism. They supposedly eat snakes, so they were felt to be protective against poisons. And the number of feathers in the caps of the court members were an indicator of rank. Notice how we also have a sense of one-point perspective. It's not true one-point perspective, but we see that, and even this natural cliff wall is very flat. It's planar, isn't it? And it's leading back into that space. Let's see. The Taoist cave heaven. So unfortunately, this is mounted on a white wall. I don't know why the museum did this because it destroys the illusion. This was actually a 7-foot tall doorway with the inside crafted to look like a rough cave hewn out of the rock. There's a notion of the Taoist cave heaven, that you could enter into this and you would pop out in another world. So you can leave the dust of the world, the toil, the conflict, the burdensome necessities of interacting with other humans. You leave all that behind and you're in this Taoist frame of mind where you're one with nature and you're not striving. So you can imagine how attractive that was to him. And there's even the famous legend of the fisherman who sees a low cave in the water and sails his boat inside and comes out into a land that reminds me of Shangri-La. It's beautiful, the people are lovely, there's plenty of food. And after some weeks or months, the fisherman thinks, my gosh, I've got to let my people know about this wonderful place. So he sails his boat back out through the cave, can never find the cave again. So there was this kind of mystique about caves, and you can see how this is a contemplative image for the emperor. And in fact, there's a poem here. Kind of unusual to have a poem on an illusionistic work of art because that destroys the illusion. So it was important for him to contemplate that. And the poem talks about his military conquests and the important young men of his court, how vital they were. And at the end, he says, he's talking about the young men and how they're like the peacocks, they're brilliant and elegant, but he comments on his military ambitions. He says, far from culture and having abandoned my reading, I am ashamed of the ambitions that I cherished. Now that is nothing you'd put in a hall where you have generals banqueting, right? This is for his eyes alone. And it's about restoring the balance, the yin-yang balance, the militant and pacifist. Let's see, it's called To Rebalance His Militancy or Wu with its complementary opposite, culture or Wen. So he's well aware of the complexity of being a human in this role that he was thrust into. I think I'm taking too long, so let me try and speed up here. His personal legacy. Of course, imperial sons were important for the dynasty, and also they had to perform the right rituals after his death to get him to where his soul needed to be. And the sons were the most important people. Everyone contributed to those ritual observances, but the sons had the most influence. But unfortunately, 13 out of 17 of his sons died, including his intended heir, Yonglian, and as well his beloved Empress Zhaojian. Died young, and even 40 years after her death, he was writing poetry to her. So his successor was this young man, Yonglian, who became the Qing Emperor. And here he confirms his interest in not just looking at the past, the glorious past, but his future, what he's contributing to the lineage of this dynasty. And this is just an amazing, again, life-size painting. And we have a view to the distant background through 2 levels in this 2-story painting. We see the sharp foreshortening, and there is directional lighting here, which so convincingly gives us the shallow carving of these areas. And let's have a closer look at the people in the painting. Here we see one of his consorts, the mother of Yongyan, and she is a good Confucian woman. We're not looking up her sleeves, for goodness sake. She's not meeting our eyes. Her concern is about her child. She's perhaps restraining a little over exuberant because he's so young. She's starting to train him. She's in this beautiful silk gown with the longevity symbols on the shoulders. She has this gorgeous kingfisher feather headdress. And at the San Diego Museum of Art, we used to have a kingfisher headdress on view. So these beautiful iridescent feathers with gems and pearls that all have symbolic meaning. And the plants behind them each echo their forms. So the long, slender forms, and also symbolically. Bamboo is hollow, it's receptive, it's flexible, it's durable. And rather comically, with this really round head, we have this fat peony, which is the royal flower of virtue. So each person is symbolized by a plant motif. Now we are invited to think of this as a space beyond this wall, and then another space beyond this wall. So let's look at another example of that from our museum. Whenever you're trying to create depth, you want the top of the wall to be clear. We need to know that that wall has depth. So here the Christ child is standing on the wall. There's a little knothole. We see some fingers on the wall. And here is a cast shadow. And I would bet they had to ask the emperor's permission for his son to be depicted casting a shadow. But it's so important here. From what we can tell, the Qianlong Emperor was affectionate, sentimental with his family. And I think this is almost like a snapshot. The child's young enough to go, "Daddy," but this child would rapidly being trained to be future emperor material, which would be very restrained, very, acting according to protocol. So this is a moment in time when that childlike connection could still occur. Okay, so finally, we're getting to his retirement. He had announced as an act of filial piety to his grandfather, the great Qing Emperor that ruled for 61 years, that he would not rule longer than him. So he would retire at 60 years of reign. And in fact, he lived for an additional 3 years and micromanaged his son. So he didn't really retire, but officially he did. So he had plenty of time to plan for his retirement. And he took this corner of the Forbidden City as his compound. And as he envisioned himself as a scholarly literatus, he supposedly wrote over 40,000 poems, which makes me think he had an army of ghostwriters, but he was a prolific poet. Here we see him pondering his next work, brush in hand, paper at the ready, his scholar's implements. That's how he envisioned his retirement. We're going to look at the inside of a building right back here in this corner next. So this is the amusingly named Studio of Exhaustion from Diligent Service. I think we know who named it. And inside we see a simulated bamboo moon gate. This is really hardwood that's decorated to look like bamboo. And we look all the way to the opposite side of the room and it appears that there's an identical gate. And if we get closer to that, we can see this scene. This is not another bamboo gate. This is a painted faux bamboo gate. And of course, Beijing is cold in the winter, right? So here we are again looking at that wonderful tropical southern Chinese region with the blue skies and the peonies, the cranes for longevity. And the magpies were a certain symbol for the Qing rulers. According to legend, the first Qing Emperor Shunzi was about to make a bad military decision when a magpie dropped something on his head and he changed his mind and it saved the day. So this is a specific dynastic symbol that's being portrayed here. So this is a small stage and this is a niche where his throne would be in that niche. Let's go to a view from just in front of the throne. Qianlong loved theater. He had thousands of theater performers. He had grand multi-level stages, trapezes. Some were big enough for elephants to walk through. But this is a very intimate theater. And it looks like there's a second level, maybe for musicians here, doors to backstage. And look at the ceiling. This is an additional faux painted ceiling, a continuation of the wisteria blossoms that you may have noticed hanging down the wall, but here they are overhead on a simulated bamboo lattice. And like all of these illusionistic paintings, there's one perfect place to stand, and it's right under this one. So you can see how the others all look like they are further away. Let's look at the Western tradition of illusionistic ceilings. In St. Ignatius Church in Rome, we see this faux cupola. This is actually a perfectly flat surface, but if you're standing on the right point in the church, which is marked on the floor, you get this illusion of this big dome and even this little lit up area at the very top. Now this is called quadratura, or illusionistic architectural interiors, and it was painted by Andrea Pozzo. We see a self-portrait here. Now, Andrea Pozzo taught Filippo Abbiati, and it is possible that Abbiati taught Castiglione. So he may have indirectly influenced him, but even if that was not the case, Pozzo wrote an extremely influential book that was translated in many languages, and much of it is online. So I encourage you to look that up because the illustrations are spectacular, both artistically and mathematically and geometrically. It was just, the whole thing is just this whole how-to manual that is exquisite. So we have to remember he was a Jesuit brother. And so this is not, he's not just pointing up saying, hey, look at the fancy ceiling I painted. He wants us to look up at the ceiling because that's looking at heaven, and that is looking towards God. And in fact, to quote him, he said, approach linear perspective with a resolution to draw all lines thereof to the true point, i.e. vanishing point, the glory of God. So right next to this ceiling in the same church, Pozzo painted this incredible work. Now, first of all, let me orient you. This is a real archway. This is the real doorway into the space. The ceiling follows this archway. So it's a barrel vaulted ceiling, like the interior of a barrel, right? So on this curved surface, if you stand in the right point, you have the illusion of all these straight columns. Can you imagine painting that illusion on a curved surface? And it explodes the top of the ceiling so that we were looking directly into heaven. And the vanishing point of all these orthogonals lead right to Jesus with the cross. And Jesus is transmitting through light to St. Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuit order. So this is the kind of amazing work that was being done in Italy. So we might ask the question, was Giuseppe Castiglione doing any quadratura in China? And in fact, he did. Unfortunately, both those churches are no longer extant, but he decorated 2 Jesuit churches in Beijing. And a contemporary, the Jesuit architect named Moji, said, the vaults are beautifully painted by Castiglione. The best painting is that of the cupola, painted on a flat canvas. To the eye, it has the effect of height and depth, thanks to the skillfully created effects of light and shadow. So as you might imagine, the math is pretty complicated. So this projective geometry was first described by Girard Derargue. So this was something you would have to learn from a master, and this skill would be passed on. And it was passed on to several Chinese artists by Castiglione. Last subject here, Yuanmingyuan, the Garden of Perfect Brightness. This is an 800-acre recreational site that's about 15 miles northwest of the Forbidden City. Most of it is Chinese style gardens, but there's one little area here, right here. This corridor is known, it can be translated as European mansions or European palaces. So Castiglione was the architect, and he had a range of kind of miniaturized palaces so that Qianlong could see the different types of architecture. Some of them look like Baroque churches, some of them look like Versailles. There was a whole variety of things. And this is where the emperors came to chill out and get away from the cares of the world. At the very end, well, let me tell you about that next. So there's an interesting story about this place. This is what exists now of the European palaces. And as we know, in the 19th century, the Western powers ganged up on China. The British forced them to import opium. And when they resisted because they didn't want to make their people addicts, they started bringing their gunboats up the river and blowing things away. So at one point, I think around the 1860s, the British sent a negotiating party. Now, I don't know how much of a negotiation it is when the backup is that we'll just blast your cities away. But this small negotiating party went to the emperor, who unfortunately ordered everyone in that party to be tortured to death. The word of this got back to the British commander, who's Lord Elgin, who's the father of the Lord Elgin, who took the Parthenon marbles to the British Museum, which the Greeks are still unhappy about. But anyway, the father was a British commander, and he said, we are going to punish China for that. And so what they did was they utterly destroyed, just destroyed it. It took several thousand men, almost a week, to demolish this. There were treasures that were even grander than the Forbidden City. There were these enormous, ornate, solid gold things that weighed hundreds of pounds. There were acres of silk tapestries that were thrown on bonfires, all kinds of jade, and there were fancy automatons that did amazing things. And so that's why this great cultural heritage was lost for posterity. Now, the funny part is, this is the original site. You can go 1,000 miles south to Hangzhou and see a full-scale replica of the European palaces, because many engravings were made of them. They know what they look like. And you can see the similarity here. See this doorway and then this S-shaped curve here? You see the same thing here with this same S shape. And the caretakers of this site think that this is just a tawdry, ridiculous Disneyland-like recreation, where the people that run this site say, what are you talking about? We're connecting the Chinese to their heritage and their history. So there's a very different attitude about the value of reproducing it like this. But the last slide I want to show you is, you see this long pond here and how you would have a great vantage point all the way down. At the end of this pond was a huge wall at the edge of this compound. So let's see what that would have looked like. Of course, it no longer exists. But here's that pond. You can see the trees, so you get the scale of this place. Here on this wall that was over 3 stories tall was an enormous Tong Jinghua. And you can imagine it was in brilliant colors, and we're seeing 1-point perspective. I'm sure there was atmospheric perspective. There were these 2 freestanding, elegant structures that again kind of form the curtains of a stage, so to speak. And this was a way for the emperors, Qianlong in particular, to get away from it all. He could imagine that he was in some Italian hill country, looking at this Western architecture, sailing in a boat with his concubines. So you think about this man who was incredibly powerful, the burdens of that power, and how he created this little walled-in fantasy world to just help him survive the stresses of rulership. I think it's kind of a poignant a note on someone that you would think, why would we have any sympathy for him? He could do whatever he wanted with millions of people. But that's the flip side of having that responsibility. So in conclusion, I think we can look at both the micro and macro levels of meaning of this. And as we talked about, this shows the human side of Qianlong and how the Tong Jinghua served to help him find his balance, feel connected with his family, and have some escapist hours of simple, uncomplicated pleasure. On the macro level, this period of the Great Qing was a collision between 2 cultures that obviously had very different values and worldviews. It was a rare time of political equipoise when both sides had the motivation to learn from one another and to change. Now, that cooperation masked a certain unresolvable differences that would show up later, but for the Middle Kingdom, this was the greatest acknowledgement to date of impending globalization that would soon follow. So I'll just show you if you can see this book, this was a major source for me. It's a wonderful book written by Christina Kluchen in 2015. And I didn't mention, but that whole area I showed you of the studio of exhaustion from diligent service, that thing had been neglected for well over 100 years. I mean, everything but the ceiling had collapsed, and there was mounds of dust and everything had fallen down. A big multi-million-dollar restoration was done, I think in 2008 of that. And there are two videos on this. Elizabeth is going to give you the links in the chat. And it's a wonderful story. This is a full-length documentary. They had to search for the, one remaining family that still knew how to do that silk brocade and that technique. And then the family had to do it over and over and over and over and get it inspected. And every family, for all the different things, woodworking and everything, was so proud and honored to be part of this historic project. So this video shows you that whole journey, and it's quite fascinating. So I hope you get a chance to look at that. So I am finally done. I've gone way over time. So I'd like to open it up for questions.